All right. Hey, everybody. Um, let's talk about the coastal plain. Um, Here's where I'm talking about. And in this talk, we're just going to be discussing the hydrogeology and the geology of the coastal plain and eastern shore, which is part of the coastal plain. Here's the Chesapeake Bay right here. So everything in red from the fall line, which is right here, all the way out to uh, the eastern side of the Chesapeake Bay. And much like the fractured rock talk, we're going to rewind the clock, in this case, 150 million years ago. So this is after the collision where North America and Africa actually collided, and you had what I referred to as the Appalachian orogeny, which is actually a term that describes several mountain building events. But anyhow, we've progressed in time from that, and the continents are now, the plates are actually pulling apart and separating. And with that separation comes what we call rifting. It's where the crust gets pulled apart and thins down and depresses, and faults form, and the crust continues to slump down as it pulls apart. And because much of the area in between the crusts is lower, it often becomes inundated or floods. And eventually these continents pull apart enough to where actually the oceans form in between them. And they'll keep pulling apart. And here we are 65 million years ago, we start to see, ancestral North America, South America, Africa, progress on to 10 million years ago. And things are starting to look much like the way they do now with respect to the shapes of the continents. And during this whole period, along the margins, one of the many things that has happened is that along the margins, they have sediments have accumulated. And it's a very complex process of sedimentation that occurs along continental margins, because you have the edge of the continent actually down warping, sediments washing in from higher ground. Remember, this all used to be mountains, and they used to be much, much higher than they were today. So you had sediments washing down from the mountains and accumulating on the coast and the continental margin. And the margin would stay stable for a while, and then it would down warp, which meant that there was an opportunity for different densities of sediment to accumulate on top of what was already there. So as a result of that down warping, you get a changing coast, and different changes in opportunities for different size sediments to collect. There are also other conditions which can cause more of the coast to be exposed, and that has to do mainly with how much water is tied up in ice, and how warm the climate becomes or how cold the climate becomes. And so the more ice you get, the less seawater you have, because it's tied up in the ice caps. And so that played some role as well in the formation of the coastal plain, just the changing elevations of the shoreline. And so all these factors contributed to the different sedimentary formations that we now have on the Atlantic margin. And here's about where Virginia is. Now, one other point I want to make, I don't want to get too involved in a climate change discussion, because that's a whole nother topic, but it's that, changing climate really does have a big influence on, obviously, where water is on the coastline. And it, kind of remains to be seen how we as humans are going to be able to deal with that. But it's something that has happened in the past. It will certainly happen again in the future. It's nothing new to the world. It's to the earth. It's just new to us. And of course, the question is, how much are we impacting that? How much are we influencing it? And what can we do to mitigate it or slow it down? Because there's some really important, and I know you all have heard this a lot, but you know, coastal cities and everything along the coast. So anyway, let's talk a little bit more about sedimentation. These are just hypothetical cross sections. And basically the further the coast is away, or the onlap of the ocean is from, let me try that again. The further out the ocean is, the further out sediments can get carried. Now, it also depends on how high up the sediments are being washed, how much energy is in the system. But basically, you see a sequence of denser or sands more toward the onlap of the ocean. And then as you progress further out toward the sea, finer and finer sediments will collect because they're more easily transported. They're lighter. They can move further out in the deeper ocean waters. And marine organisms also play a huge role in the creation of sediments on the coastal margin as well. Lots of very small organisms have, when they die, they leave behind shells with lots of calcium carbonate in them. And over geologic time, that material can actually turn into limestone. So again, a very complex system, one that is constantly changing. And when you look at, take a core through the sediments in this stuff, you see a very complex and interesting story about the types of organisms that have lived near in Virginia over the past, tens of millions of years, and where rivers were in relation to the ocean. There's parts of the Virginia Piedmont that were at one point in time covered up by the ocean. So we're talking about miles and miles inland from where it is today. And this umbrella just kind of gives you, this is in a fixed position. In this case, the ocean has migrated landward. It could have been due to a sinking coastline, due to rifting. It could be that ice caps melted. We don't really know, but it provides an opportunity for sedimentation to occur further inland. And so the once coarser sediments are now being deposited, having finer grain materials deposited on it. And that's just part of the whole record that's playing out here. And here is our umbrella, millions of years later, and it's completely covered up by newer formations. So we've kind of briefly discussed how these materials are deposited, but what types of materials how does that relate hydrologically? How do these materials form aquifers? And typically it's the more permeable materials that make good aquifers. So we're talking about sands, shell beds, moldic limestone that was, old reef material. And all this stuff is very porous, but it's also permeable, allows water to pass through it. Clays, on the other hand, which originated from the deposition of these finer, very fine sediments, may be very porous, but they're not permeable at all. they can actually act as what we call confining units to confine the system, because water can't move through them. It's just the way that the pore spaces line up don't permit passage of water. And so here's a coast cross section of basically the present day coastal plain. It's not to scale. It's what we have, what we call vertically exaggerated, meaning that it's a lot thicker relative to the distance depicted than it is in real life. But what the vertical exaggeration does is give you the ability to kind of look at the different components of the system and understand it better, because they're not all squished down. And so on the east, we have the fall zone. Lots of cities were built right on the fall zone. If you remember from your Virginia history, Richmond, obviously, Fredericksburg, because they could move barges and stuff up the tidal portions of the river and drop off their goods at a city located pretty far inland. And barges at the time going up and down the river were one of the easiest ways to transport goods. So anyway, you go from the fall zone on out to the Chesapeake Bay on the east side. The eastern shore somewhere over here. It's not really on this particular cross section. And what we see is kind of like, pretend you have a giant knife and you're cutting down through the earth. You bring it up and you look at it, almost like a, you know, three or I guess, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 5 layer cake. And the icing acts as confining zones between each layer of aquifer. If you want to, that's kind of like the analogy I like to use. So each aquifer is a little zone of cake that's capped by these clay units or icing that doesn't want to let water pass through it very easily. It can let water pass through it, but it takes thousands and thousands of years in some cases. So water can only really get in along the fall zone or through breaches in the confining unit. Another thing I want to point out is this feature here. This is called the Chesapeake Bay Impact Crater. And it was what we call a bolide. That's the geologic term for it. A meteor that smashed down into present day Chesapeake Bay and rapidly ejected all the sediments out of the impact area, which was like 50 miles in diameter. So we're not talking about a little feature here. It instantly ejected all these sediments and they washed back in and got all jumbled up. And because they got all jumbled up, water can't pass through this feature very well at all. So this whole impact crater acts as a plug on the aquifer system. At the base here, you have the Potomac Aquifer. The porous materials in the Potomac Aquifer are sands that were transported by ancient rivers. And then you migrate up through the Potomac confining zone into the Aquia. That's a marine type aquifer comprised of mainly marine sediments. Same with the Piney Point. Then migrate on up to the surface. And one thing you notice here is that the Chesapeake Bay Impact Crater is actually capped by the Piney Point, the Calvert, Yorktown, Eastover. That means these materials were deposited after the impact. So for a long time, people had no idea this crater was here, but it is, and it's one of the biggest impact features in the world. Let's talk about hydraulic pressures in these aquifers. Let's pretend we drilled 3 wells right here, 10 feet apart from each other. One in the superficial aquifer, one in the Piney Point right here. So we're down about maybe 100, 200 feet here. And then one way down in the Potomac, maybe 800 feet down. what happens, or what you would see, is that the water levels in each one of these wells are pretty drastically different. And there's about 100 feet of difference between water levels in the superficial aquifer and the Potomac aquifer. Even though they were only built like, say, 10 feet apart, the water levels are pressures in these systems are so different. And that's, again, because they're confined systems and they're pressurized with their own pressures. The Potomac used to be have a lot more pressure in it, but it's a large regional aquifer that people depend on really heavily. So it's been pumped a lot, and all that pumping has reduced pressures in the aquifer system. This is output from a computer model. This model was constructed by the United States Geologic Survey, and it's of the coastal plain. And the whole reason for the existence of this model is to use it in a predictive sense. We can ask it, well, if we put in a well here and pump it, what will the impacts be regionally? Because this is a regional system. And really what we have are multiple pumping centers that are stressing the aquifer, and the impact crater, again, is acting like a big plug. You can see how water levels are being drawn down, but they can't cross over into this crater, which means that pumping influences have to actively seek out water elsewhere in the system, because this area here can't provide water. And this computer model, or one very similar to it, is actually used to manage permitting in the coastal plain aquifer. So if you want to withdraw over a certain amount of water, you have to apply for a permit. Depending on where you are in the system, they put a well in and they pump it theoretically in the model to see what kind of impact that might have regionally on the system. So the main points of this talk are that viable or productive aquifers in the coastal plain are made up of units with higher permeability: sand, shell, sometimes that reef material or moldic limestone. And aquifers are confined by lower permeability clays. They act as like walls to the pipe, a pressurized pipe, and these clays confine the system and pressurize it. And the stratigraphy in the coastal plain is controlled by relative sea level, and changes the position of the sea relative to the coast is dependent on whether or not the coastline is subsiding, whether due to rifting, whether or not there's ice tied up in the ice caps and things of that nature. Whether or not it's a high energy system, meaning is there a lot of ability for the sediment to be transported from higher elevation areas to the coast, or is it more flat? Is it harder for it to get transported? And that'll have a big influence over the types of sediment that are deposited in any given spot. And the coastal plain is an actively managed regional aquifer system. And this is the last sort of parting slide. And I just wanted to tie up groundwater withdrawals throughout tie up this talk with showing you a slide of groundwater withdrawals throughout the whole state. And these are withdrawals that are reported to the Department of Environmental Quality for users that withdraw over a certain amount monthly. So we're talking about cities, we're talking about industry, farms, some farming operations. And what you see is that a lot of these larger withdrawals occur in the coastal plain and in karst geology. And that's because the geology allows it. It's that simple. If you want to get big water, if you want to have big withdrawals from a groundwater system, you got to be in a place where the geology permits it. And it sounds simple to say that, but actively, seeking out and finding aquifers or portions of aquifer that are capable of sustaining these types of withdrawals is not always an easy thing to do. So stay tuned for the last talk, and it will be on analyzing groundwater data, and also just brief discussion on how to go about trying to find out, delineate and seek aquifer systems that may be capable of providing these types of larger withdrawals.